Good morning. Welcome to the third uh, part of our four-part series on how Houston becomes the low carbon energy capital of the world. Today's discussion is going to be on hydrogen. I'm Ramanan Krishnamurthy. I'm the Chief Energy Officer here at the University of Houston. Welcome to all of you for joining us on this important conversation. If you're interested in learning more about the study that we've carried out in collaboration with the Center for Houston's Future, you can find it on our website, Houston Low Carbon Energy Capital, 4 Ways Forward. We've already discussed carbon capture utilization storage on October 9th. You can watch that video. It's available, as is the video for our electric grid conversation that happened on October 16th. Today's conversation is going to focus on hydrogen. And for this, I want to especially thank our collaborators at the Center for Houston's Future, Brett Perlman and Laura Goldberg, who have really been instrumental in getting this work done and get it to the point where it is ready for public scrutiny. I want to thank my colleagues at the Gutierrez Energy Management Institute and the Bauer College of Business, specifically Greg Bean and his group there, for driving us to move on this work and get it to a point where it can be made available to the broader public. My colleague Jeannie Keever has been somebody that we have really lent pretty heavily on to get this material ready again. I want to thank the Texas Industrial Energy Efficiency Program for their support in promoting this program. So one of the prime people who has driven our study here has been Andy Steinhubel. Andy is going to moderate the panel today, and he has been rubbing it in for all of us, letting us know that he's just recently retired and enjoying retirement. He spent over 35 years in various industrial positions, dealing with all different things in the energy world, most recently from KPMG. And KPMG has been an incredible partner in our efforts here to really come up with a techno-economic model for how hydrogen can really transform the decarbonization of the Houston ecosystem. Andy has very wide experience in all different aspects of the energy world, oil and gas, midstream, power, as well as chemicals. And today, his expertise in hydrogen will become plainly evident to all of you. With that, I want to hand it off to Andy to lead this discussion. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for that very kind introduction, Ramanan. I can't think of a better way to enjoy my retirement than talking about a topic that I have grown to feel as passionate about as hydrogen. Having dug into it now, I would say that the opportunity for Houston has exceeded my expectations, which is saying a lot, because my prior experience has suggested when you put Houston and energy together, you tend to see exciting things. Well, this is by no means an exception, and I think could be among one of the greatest opportunities for Houston to lead in the low carbon era. We're going to share a summary of our findings. We're going to build towards a roadmap for expanding Houston's role in clean hydrogen and hydrogen in our energy system. A more detailed report will be available in roughly the November timeframe. Very happy to have, as part of this presentation, 3 U of H students. They developed assessments of what a variety of other countries are doing in hydrogen, have put together case studies on projects that are occurring across the value chain, from production all the way through to new markets and various uses of hydrogen in markets, have conducted analytical studies on Houston's existing assets and cost position in various market studies. So all of that was instrumental to developing the roadmap, which we'll build to. And then also thanks to my colleagues or former colleagues on the KPMG strategy team, Todd Blackford and Josh Gresham. So Josh, I don't know if you have control of the slideware, but we may want to move to the kickoff of this presentation. Let me just pause there for a second, Josh. I just mentioned the students' names who'll be speaking here momentarily. Matt Hoffman, Sujaja Fatma, the team calls her Z, and Catherine Wynn. And then I mentioned Todd and Josh at the bottom. Go ahead, Josh. Thank you. So the bottom line of this presentation is we believe Houston has a unique opportunity to provide global leadership in the hydrogen arena, but subject to activating that potential for leadership, and that will require policy and funding support, and we'll come back to that at the very end. But I'd like to start the discussion with an overview of the dynamics, the global dynamics, which are driving the rapid expansion of the hydrogen market. So I might turn your attention to the starburst on the middle upper right, which shows the 10 times demand growth. That's an estimate from the Hydrogen Council that the market for hydrogen gas is expected to grow by tenfold between today and 2050. And that's essentially working backwards from the amounts of hydrogen that will be required to achieve decarbonization targets akin to 2050 net zero. Hydrogen can reach places that electrification and batteries alone cannot reach, is the projection. Things like industrial process heat, steel manufacture, cement manufacture, heavy trucking where payload requirements, refueling time, uptime are at a premium, and therefore batteries aren't as effective a solution as hydrogen. So those areas, hard to abate emissions areas, are the natural home for hydrogen as part of the decarbonization strategy. Most countries who put out, essentially all countries who put out decarbonization with hydrogen are seeking to get there ultimately through what's known as green hydrogen, which is splitting water molecules into oxygen and hydrogen. And that's done through electrolysis and requires a significant amount of power, and ideally green power, to make the whole chain entirely green. That's requiring a lot because there's a relatively modest amount of renewable power today. So to grow the renewable power and to improve the technology around electrolysis, the cost of the reaction, the separation reaction, the manufacturing efficiencies is going to take a while for the market to scale. But the objective ultimately is green. So you see the green wedge there. If you move back to the left-hand side and the y-axis where it shows 100 and gray, gray hydrogen refers to the source of effectively nearly all of hydrogen that's produced today, which is coming from methane, splitting methane molecules, CH4, into hydrogen and carbon, and that becomes carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. So that's a high emissions way to produce hydrogen, but that's the way it's being produced today. So the question is how we get from here to there. How do we get from left to right? And it's a lot of volumes to get from left to right. So where the European Council has come out, countries like the Netherlands, Germany, others, is that to get the scale we need to begin with turning our gray hydrogen to blue. And that means taking the gray hydrogen and pairing it with carbon capture, ideally usage, sequestration. So take the carbon dioxide out of the gray hydrogen. And further, again, in order to get the volumes quick enough, leveraging the infrastructure and scale of the existing gray system, incrementally adding new gray capacity, could be more advanced technology to again split methane molecules. So that's the expansion of the blue wedge in that 2030, call it 2030, 2040 timeframe to get the volumes quick enough. Now, in the meantime, the green chain's being incubated. incubated. It's a matter of how do we get the volumes from what source quick enough. And the leanings of most strategies are we've got to start with the gray and expand the gray through blue in order to get the volumes quick enough. Now the shapes and the timings can slide. So this is illustrative. What drives it from a local standpoint on the upper right-hand side of the chart under localized drivers is, does the country or state or province region have a 2050 net zero or similar goal? That's going to slide that dotted line there, left, right, or maybe in some cases, currently in many places in the US, there isn't such a dotted line. Is there a carbon tax or fee that tends to incent the degree to which the blue and the green chains can come to market? Does a country have an existing SMR system, gray hydrogen system, and what's the scale of that system? And do they have resources that lend themselves to renewables, wind resources, solar resources? That, of course, will dictate the shape and the timing of the green wedge. And then there are things that'll improve the economics and change the game for all participants across markets. That's on the lower right. That's things largely to do with improvements in electrolysis technology and the economics of renewables, including offshore wind, which is a big part of the future equation. So these are all the factors. And what our team did in the course of the study, underpinned by the work of the students I mentioned, is customize that roadmap to Houston. So let's dig into that a little bit further. So we started with a grounding in the strategies undertaken by others that I mentioned. And then we developed case studies of projects, hydrogen projects across the chain, the drivers of those projects, the implications of Houston. And then we overlaid those understandings with an understanding of the Houston system. So we documented the cost position, the scale position of the assets across the existing hydrogen SMR system in the Gulf Coast. We'll show you a depiction of that and some statistics on that in a moment. We looked at the power markets and how they would play into green chains in the Gulf Coast and the greater Houston area. And then out of that, determined our best leverage points to expand our hydrogen position. So we focused on incremental economics. Where does the Gulf Coast, Houston area have a leg up? Those would be the places to focus on getting in. And then once in, we looked at how those positions could be developed, scaled, expanded, and what, if you will, the full potential of a Houston hydrogen system might look like. And then lastly, we developed some views on how to action these plans, what the next steps would be, and highlighted areas where policy and funding support would be important to activate those actions. I apologize, I missed on the right-hand side, a big miss. We had a number of collaborators who kindly contributed to this effort, contributed data, contributed perspectives. In some cases, were kind enough to review some of our work in progress material, share feedback on it, and they were integral to our being able to develop this material. So thank you to all of our contributors. Sorry, Josh, thank you. So going a little bit deeper into the findings, although these will all be embellished further in a few moments by the team. I mentioned the first point, there's a very large market that's anticipated. Hydrogen gas alone growing from roughly 200 million today to 800 billion to approximately $1 trillion in 2050. Again, driven by the needs and unique opportunities for hydrogen to support decarbonization. If we add on to that related equipment, electrolyzers, fuel cells, et cetera, that's a $2.5 trillion market. So a massive market, very rapidly developing in hydrogen. Now, coming back to Houston, Houston has a tremendous hand to play. And again, we'll show you some statistics on that, but Houston has a world premier existing position. It's a great position, but we've got multiple plants, pipelines, storage caverns that we can inventory hydrogen, rights of way, we can push hydrogen out through the rest of the country, many assets linked to our heritage Gulf Coast position that are readily leverageable to bring hydrogen at scale to new market opportunities. We also have, by virtue of being the leading wind state and having a competitive power market, which allows for and is allowing for additional wind and additional solar. Those sources of power come with a number of low cost hours, because sometimes the wind blows when not as much demand for power exists. So that creates cheap power. Similarly with solar. And the good news about that cheap power is it can be leveraged in a hydrogen world through electrolysis, which absorbs a lot of power to start to create green hydrogen. So we've got a couple of areas where we think the Houston area can uniquely exploit that. One is through our large salt cavern storage, which I mentioned, and you pair that with very high summer winter differentials, price differentials, and you can use hydrogen. You can create hydrogen across that differential and basically bank it when prices are low and pull it out and run it through fuel cells or burn it when prices are high. And that could be a very nice way to bring hydrogen into the power system. Also, as more renewables come into the generation mix, that brings more intermittency, brings a higher imperative for storage. Batteries do well for short durations, but once you get into more than 6 hours, certainly multiple days, weeks, if not seasonal, then you're getting into other storage technologies, and hydrogen is foremost among those. So we have some areas we'll embellish where we see getting into the chains, both the blue and the green chain, the blue at scale, green to start to incubate. And then we have a vision, which one of my colleagues will go through, about where that can go, how we can scale that, similar to the gray to blue to green chart that I showed earlier, but unique to Houston and unique to the extent of that gray system and a number of assets associated with it. And then lastly, we'll end on next steps. And as I mentioned earlier, policy and funding requirements to activate these opportunities. So I'm going to turn it over to the students. They're going to go through the case study portions and some of the fact base on Houston. And then my colleagues will end on forward plans. So Catherine?
Thank you, Andy. So Rotterdam provides a great example of an industrial area that has developed a hydrogen strategy following the gray to blue to green strategy Andy spoke about earlier. Rotterdam has an existing gray hydrogen system to support its refining operations. Their near-term hydrogen plan involves adding CCUS to the gray system, creating blue hydrogen, and storing carbon dioxide in depleted oil and gas fields. Additionally, green hydrogen is being incubated by using offshore wind to power electrolyzers that will create green hydrogen. In the midterm, high volumes of new blue hydrogen is built to decarbonize emission-intensive industrial processes in the port area. At the same time, green pilot tests are extended with additional offshore renewables and electrolyzers. So ultimately, Rotterdam plans to transform from an oil and gas hub today to a hydrogen hub tomorrow. As a hydrogen hub, Rotterdam would produce and import hydrogen to not only be used in the Netherlands, but a large portion of that will also be transported inland to be used elsewhere in Northwest Europe. So I'm going to pass on the slides to Matt, and he'll explain what does this mean for Houston, and what are some of the implications that we can learn from this example.
Thanks, Catherine. So as we turn to Houston, we really find that it's home to the world's leading hydrogen infrastructure that allows the region to bring a substantial amount of clean hydrogen to market quickly. What does that mean in context? Well, the Texas Gulf Coast produces 8.5 times what is produced in Rotterdam, and it also includes a system of over 900 miles of dedicated hydrogen pipeline that makes up nearly a third of the hydrogen pipelines globally. Conveniently enough also, and as Andy had mentioned, the Houston region is also home to the world's largest storage caverns. These natural formations provide an infrastructure to store hydrogen, and in the long term, we see could be utilized as a sort of hydrogen warehouse to store inventory needed for new markets that come at scale. So if Rotterdam is a developing model being used to expand the use of hydrogen, we see the Houston infrastructure as being well equipped to meet demand of new markets. So what might those new markets be? Well, we'll take a look at that here. And after assessing some of the challenges and barriers of a few different markets, we found heavy duty trucking to be the most attractive. And there are a few reasons for this. First, and as I mentioned before, the significant infrastructure in the region will lead us to a relatively minimal amount of new infrastructure being required to initiate the program. In addition, when hydrogen is used as a fuel in heavy duty trucks and long haul service, it's economically competitive when compared to diesel and battery electrics in the same service. So in looking at the potential markets in the Houston area that could be accessed, there are three that emerged. One was the I-45 corridor along between Houston and Dallas. The next was Houston to San Antonio along I-10. And the final was the chemical trucking market at the Houston Ship Channel. Of those, we show here the I-45 corridor. And assessing the position of hydrogen versus diesel, we built a cost of ownership model, and within it, we assessed both capital and operational expenses, like the new truck cost, associated costs of filling stations, the carbon capture equipment, and also the cost to produce the hydrogen and operate and maintain new vehicles. So we mirrored both of these inputs really for diesel and hydrogen vehicles, and this provided us with the outputs shown in the chart below. And what we found and what the chart shows is that within 5 years, hydrogen has a lower total cost of ownership than diesel. The values in the chart at the bottom are net present value and include all associated costs of the vehicles listed in millions. And if you look on the right-hand side of the chart, you'll see the blue hydrogen portion. From 2021 through the next 5 years, the total cost to own and operate a new truck over that time span is $1.71 million. And as we progressed and scaled up the number of trucks in the fleets, costs greatly diminished. And from 2026, over the next 10 years, the cost of ownership for that same vehicle drops down to $770,000. The economies of scale we see here are really linked to the hydrogen infrastructure, but additionally, we found that the low cost to produce the hydrogen and the anticipated increasing cost of diesel were primary drivers for the cost advantages. Also, in one of the checks to assure the numbers held weight, we reviewed a published report completed last year by the International Council on Clean Transportation. And what this report studied was hydrogen used for heavy-duty trucking at the Port of LA, and showed that by 2030, hydrogen trucks are advantaged both over diesel and battery electrics in long-haul services. So with all these findings in mind, we turned to think about the options to launch hydrogen for heavy-duty trucking. And gray hydrogen came to us as the initial catalyst for the program, because even while gray hydrogen remains a carbon emission intensive process, when compared to diesel, there's an immediate well-to-wheel emissions reduction that it provides. And additionally, it provides us with the ability to avoid some of the time and cost associated with building new carbon capture equipment that's required for blue. So to summarize, we see that initiating the hydrogen market for Houston in the heavy duty trucking market is really a near-term priority, as some of the costs are competitive with diesel within the next 5 years. We also see that a pilot can be launched in the next 1 to 2 years through the use of the existing gray system. So with all that said, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Z for some insights about the opportunities for green hydrogen.
Okay, thanks, Matt. So in addition to blue hydrogen, Texas has advantages that can improve green hydrogen economics and support growing a green hydrogen industry over time. However, the cost of producing green hydrogen through electrolysis is currently relatively high versus blue hydrogen production. And that is driven largely by the volumes and cost of power required for electrolysis. Having said that, Texas does have two key advantages when it comes to power prices. The first advantage is the extended periods of low price hours all year round. As displayed on the left-hand graph, we can see that about 90% of hours have prices that are less than 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour, essentially making Texas among the lowest states for power prices. There are two main reasons for these low-cost hours. A, Texas has a very competitive market structure, and B, it has extensive renewable power generation. In fact, Texas is number one when it comes to wind capacity and is projected number two for solar by 2025. The second advantage when it comes to power prices for Texas is the existence of high seasonal price differentials combined with high volume cavern shortage. As displayed on the graph on the right side, we can see that in summer and fall, peak prices are about 3 times and 6 times higher to that in spring and winter. This high variance in prices creates an opportunity to produce and store hydrogen during the cheaper spring and winter months, and then use that hydrogen to produce electricity during the higher cost summer and fall. So as we can see, Texas does not only have unique advantages for just blue hydrogen, but it also has advantages for green hydrogen. And now I'll pass it over to Todd, who's going to brief us on Houston's potential to globalize in hydrogen leadership.
Thanks, Z. Pulling this all together, Houston has the potential to become a leader in the future hydrogen economy. I will now walk you through several areas in which, if fully developed, will lead Houston to becoming the global hydrogen hub of the future. First of all, thinking through production, we can further expand our blue hydrogen system by leveraging the low-cost methane out of West Texas and combining that with hydrogen production technology. This expansion of the blue hydrogen system will require extending our CCUS system within the Gulf Coast area and potentially out into West Texas. And on the green side, we can further grow green production through expanding on our existing current and growing onshore wind and solar production while exploring offshore production as electrolysis and offshore wind production technologies evolve and cost is reduced. From a logistics standpoint, Houston has an unparalleled position, across the globe. We can further expand our salt cavern storage to create a centralized hydrogen inventory hub. Leveraging our existing pipeline network that Matt discussed earlier, with limited modifications, we can easily move blue and green hydrogen locally and in and out of the salt caverns. And then we can also create a world-class export position through leveraging the ship channel and our pipeline export capabilities. On the market side, we can first look locally, and we can further expand on the heavy hauling market discussed earlier to create a centralized hub between Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio. And we can also further expand that locally into duty buses servicing the Houston metro system, as well as select port and airport equipment transportation needs. Nationally, through our existing pipeline right-of-ways, we can further expand the heavy haul trucking to create a larger hydrogen-based corridor. For example, I-10 out to California, or I-45 connected into I-35 to go up into the Midwest. And finally, on the market side, maybe more long-term, but perhaps the largest market would be deploying hydrogen as a means to decarbonize the Gulf Coast area's vast industrial processes. So in summary, Houston has unique advantages that when combined are unlike any other area globally, enabling Houston to become a global hydrogen hub of the future. I will now turn it over to Josh to discuss how we make this happen.
Thanks, Todd. This is certainly a bold vision and one that we believe strongly that's achievable with all the unique hydrogen advantages that Houston has. So where do we get started? There are 4 immediate initiatives. 2 are related to blue and 2 are related to green. If we look at blue, looking at the left-hand part of the slide on the screen here, the first is launching a heavy trucking pilot that Matt spoke about earlier that emerged from prioritizing the different end markets. The next steps here to launching it are building a coalition across the value chain. And think about industrial gas players, midstream companies to transport the hydrogen, truck manufacturers, which we have several in the region, and also station operators to fill up the trucks. After that, it's selecting one or more of the attractive markets that Todd just highlighted. And then from there, it's building a roadmap to enter and scale each of the markets that are selected. As an example, there's some work ongoing on I-45 right now by the North Central Texas Council of Governments. They have some DOE funding to look at, to bring some stakeholders together and develop a plan to enter zero emission vehicles along that corridor. And it's certainly a model that we could look at as others think about doing that for the other attractive markets. The second initiative is linking the existing hydrogen system to carbon capture, usage, and storage. And that's on the bottom left-hand part of the slide here. And part of the UH Low Carbon Initiative did involve developing a plan for integrating hydrogen plants in the Houston area along with other CO2 sources into CCUS and then extending that over time. I'll just give a quick recap on kind of the phased approach that they used. The first was the activate period, which is the initiative we're talking about here. It's integrating the CO2 sources with the existing Denbury system that runs all the way from Mississippi along the Texas Gulf Coast region. And then as you expand and bring more CO2 sources into that, it's extending that CCUS system into Central Texas, some nearby offshore locations. And then in the long term, as you scale hydrogen and integrate more and more CO2 sources, you can see that CCUS system extending into West Texas, the Permian, et cetera, and further offshore to really capture and leverage the scale for the different uses of CO2. Coming back to where we are here, the next step for this initiative is building off of that UH plan for the activate phase, forming a stakeholder coalition, think again, industrial gas companies, CCUS providers, and really taking it to the next step of building out that detailed plan. Which plants are you going to add? How much do those cost? How do you prioritize both the sources and uses of CO2? And then over time, as that hydrogen economy grows, as I mentioned earlier, that system will need to be extended. And then switching over to green, one initiative exploring that seasonal hydrogen storage opportunities that several of the colleagues in the UH team has highlighted here. To be clear right up front, these steps don't involve technical feasibility. That's already been proven. In fact, Houston has 3 at-scale hydrogen storage caverns in place for industrial gas use. The activity in this initiative really focuses on understanding the most cost-effective options for using those hydrogen storage caverns and as part of that hydrogen economy. One example relates to, just like we talked about, storing hydrogen as produced in off-peak times, and then leveraging that seasonally to put that back on the market during high period price times. The Gas Technology Institute, GTI, does have some funding, and they're looking at how do you best use these storage caverns, and this could certainly be one way for exploring that opportunity here. The other green initiative is piloting long duration storage. Just quickly putting that in context, as a few people have highlighted, the renewable penetration in Texas is about 23% today, and that's projected to increase notably. And then as that renewable penetration increases, it creates a larger role and need for long duration storage. And that's where you can really see hydrogen potentially playing a role, both to offset that intermittency and also improve and maximize the value from your renewable assets. The key step in this initiative is for the Public Utility Commission to assess the potential role for hydrogen to meet that need for long duration storage. And then lastly, and importantly, is policy and funding. Launching these 4 initiatives does require operational changes, new infrastructure, and they're unlikely to progress without some type of targeted policy and funding. An example of policy and funding to reference could be the measures that were taken by the Texas Utility Commission in the early 2000s to spark the wind market. And if we look at where Texas is today, the #1 state in the US for wind generation capacity with about 25 gigawatts, which is a pretty astounding number. Todd laid out a pretty compelling vision for us. So what do we need to do beyond just activating? And I'll cover that next. So as we look at, our team put together a customized roadmap that uses a phased approach, and it works backwards from the end goal of establishing and realizing that vision that Todd laid out and becoming that global hydrogen hub. I won't go through all the details due to time constraints and get onto the panel and some real global insights here, but I'll just give you guys a few ideas of what we did go through. The phased approach does have 3 phases: activate, expand, and rollout. And then for each of those phases, we had production, markets, and investment. So the production is basically the source of hydrogen. That could be gray, blue, green, or teal. And that teal color is really to represent as the hydrogen economy grows, it could either be blue or green hydrogen, depending on how some of those enablers that come together that Andy talked about. On the market side, we can see a variety here, but just to name a few: heavy trucking, extended duty transit buses, exporting hydrogen to advantage markets could definitely be another one. We see a large potential for Houston. And then lastly is the investment cost. We looked through some analysis and different numbers to estimate the investment cost required to realize using hydrogen in these markets during the activate and expand. And as you can appreciate, that investment cost grows as you expand the role and use of hydrogen. However, I'll end by highlighting some of the benefits from growing hydrogen in the Houston area, which are vast, significant, and manyfold. Economic diversification, job creation, reducing emissions, de-risking the conventional oil and gas industry with the looming decarbonization around the corner, and then also just opening up new markets and profit opportunities for the Houston area to capture. And then I'll kick it over to Andy to give us some final remarks for our presentation.
Thanks a lot, Josh. Thanks a lot, team. I think very, very well summarized, very well said. I might just briefly mention the activate, expand, rollout nomenclature that Josh articulated around the roadmap we adopted from the MPC study. And with guidance from our U of H colleagues, we've adopted that across the 4 initiatives. And it resonated with us because, again, we're trying to start with where does Houston have the biggest legs up? And it's around there we have the smallest funding gaps and policy needs to get started. And in many cases, as you saw with what Matt laid out, once you get over the activation hump, many of these areas start to be self-funding, but they've got to get over a hump. And so there does need to be some sort of support in the beginning. And then you saw the other phases that Josh laid out. So thank you for that. Thank you again to all the collaborators who were so helpful along the way. And now, without further ado, I'd like to shift gears and introduce our panelists and get into the open discussion. So with that, let me start by introducing Allison Book. Allison is the VP of Energy Transition at Baker Hughes. She oversees both Baker Hughes's transition to a lower carbon footprint, as well as developing products and services for customers to meet the dual challenge of lower carbon and providing energy, low-cost energy to the world. She has a background as a geoscientist and as a policymaker and has had a number of leadership positions in both arenas. Our second panelist this morning is Maria João Duarte. Maria is the representative to the European Union for Mitsubishi Power Europe. She represents Mitsubishi across a cross-section of EU initiatives and EU institutions, as well as global initiatives such as the Hydrogen Council. João, as she likes to be referred to, has over 10 years of public affairs experience and is specialized in energy and climate change. Our third panelist is Thomas Koch Blank. Thomas is a senior vice principal at the Rocky Mountain Institute. Thomas has extensive cross-industry experience around energy and climate change challenges, both from an analytical perspective and an on-site perspective, and has undertaken many projects regarding energy and carbon productivity. And then fourthly and lastly, Randy Bell. Randy is the Director of Global Energy at the Atlantic Council. Randy helped launch that group and now leads it and its research and programs nationally and globally, including a well-regarded annual conference in Abu Dhabi. Randy previously played leadership roles in a number of other preeminent foundations where he's focused on country development strategies, national security issues, and cyber issues. So very excited to have such a globally grounded policy, science, diversified panel to in part react to what we just presented, but to bring importantly their own perspectives and the roles of their companies and institutions in the hydrogen economy. So I'd like to turn to some questions for our panelists and just ask each of you if you could just share your overall views of hydrogen, the hydrogen market drivers, and then how your particular company or institution plays into those markets. So perhaps start with Allison. We'll just go in the order of the introductions.
Oh, you're putting me on the spot here. I thought maybe
you thought we were going to go last,
alphabetical. Huh? Yeah, and then I would get to go last and say like what they said. But I guess I'm just really quickly. You know, I'm here representing the views of Baker Hughes, and I'll tell you when it's not Baker Hughes. But generally speaking, we're an energy technology company, and how we're looking at hydrogen and hydrogen solutions is really one part of what I would call a more modular approach to energy transition. And what I mean by that is that I think there's this, just like how you break out themes for this seminar, you know, you'll have CCS 1 week, hydrogen 1 week, et cetera. But really what we're illustrating in what was just presented is that there are solutions that are going to converge. And so there's like going to be an energy transition, call it a product and service toolkit that can be put together in different ways for different markets, okay? And one will work in one place and one might work in another, but with the idea that you can integrate different pieces into systems. You could take hydrogen and CCS and think about how to couple that with LNG at some point. You could have a hub like you've proposed here, but it's gonna really relate to, you know, what a certain geographic needs are, okay? As well as then looking at will the market bear the cost? So, and what kinds of policy and incentives? And so I'm very supportive of what was laid out in terms of thinking about the federal investment. You know, that's something that we're really keen to continue to explore as a company, particularly with partners like University of Houston. And then thinking about three things really quick. I call them the 3 Ps that are needed as the successful ingredients for deployment of hydrogen in an area particularly like Houston. 1, public funding, check, you guys are thinking about that. 2, private sector prowess, okay? Pull in the technical expertise of companies like Baker Hughes, like Mitsubishi and others. Shell, I saw, was one of your partners, so that's the private sector prowess. And the third is fairly assertive policy making, okay? And not just done with someone, you know, in a smart place putting a policy together. You really need to have consensus-driven policy that you can work on in various interest groups and such, and then with communities. And the success of the project that we're talking about and the concept of turning Houston into a hydrogen hub really hinges on Houston really buying into having the social license to operate for this project. And so that collective view on pulling all of those together, like you guys have been doing it, and that Brett is very aggressively trying to do, I think will lead to the overall success of converting Houston from being the energy capital to also being like the hydrogen sort of of the world. So I'll hand it over to the next person.
Okay. Could I just ask you, just briefly comment, what's Baker Hughes doing in hydrogen? More specific,
yeah, so
if you don't mind.
Thank you for that. I feel like I get a little bit of a commercial in here. So here's for your commercial. We actually have a company that's our turbo machinery and process solutions. We shorthand that and call it TPS. And basically, this is the part of our organization that looks at a couple pieces of the hydrogen toolkit, and that's in the turbine aspect of it and energy production, and then there's also compression. So we have solutions in both space. In particular, we've got a turbine line called Nova LT, and that's one where you can actually have a natural gas hydrogen mix and kind of burn system. And so that's an area we actually just had a really quite successful test pilot with SNAM on that, and you can go and kind of read about that. And so that's part of it. But the other piece is that we are looking to see where else we'd like to really engage, because we also have energy storage solutions, particularly in the subsurface. And so that's, again, going back to layering different parts of an energy transition toolkit to get to something that will fit in a specific community. So, and then at the end of the day, we'll spend quite a bit of time looking at deep policy engagement so that we can really address barriers to market as we start to even expand our portfolio of products and services a little bit more broadly.
Excellent. So you have offers in both the blue and the green chains, if you will, and then enabling the overall market, like you said. Fantastic. Thank you.
Correct. Thank you.
Zhao, would you care to go next, please?
Of course. First, thank you very much for having me all the way across the Atlantic. Good morning, everyone. I'm closer to the weekend, however, so lucky me. So I think I concur with most of what Alison said. As Mitsubishi Power being part of the MHI group, we see hydrogen as part of the answer. It's not the silver bullet. As we say, there will be other solutions from a technical and market point of view to reach climate neutrality by 2050. But hydrogen, we see it as playing a huge role, especially if you consider the scale of the challenge. We have to reduce by 45% the greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 on a global scale if we want to stay under the 1.5 degree C scenario. We will still have an increase in the energy use by 2050 of some 25%, which means that we need cleaner, more efficient and more circular sources, but also uses. And finally, and which I think resonates in this context of Houston, the risk of stranded assets that are becoming a major concern in terms of financial stability all over the world. And when I looked at what was presented in the report and I look at the assets, I think this will be really a way of converting certain assets and give it a different future and revenue streams. So this report in its 4 dimensions really makes a key contribution to this discussion. I understand that recently there was an announcement by the City of Houston on carbon neutrality by 2050, so it's obviously very timely. As MHI, we are really well positioned, I would say, in the whole conversation. This is reflected by the broad portfolio of solutions we have across the value chain, ranging from offshore wind, electrolyzers, carbon capture, so blue and green. It's really no issue. Centralized power heat generation solution. So of course our hydrogen gas turbines, but also our solid oxide fuel cells. And finally also industrial, so technologies that will be applicable in the industrial setting, especially in the steel sector. So all in all, I think your study is quite, it matches quite what Europe has been doing as well. At EU level, at national level, we see a lot of also regional level within each country. It's quite comprehensive and it's very exciting. So yeah, I think I will get it over here. So
yeah, that's great, Zhao. And you know, we one of the case studies we didn't have time to go into today is the Delta project in Utah, where Mitsubishi is playing a major role. And thank you for all that the company's doing. You're getting into some of the hardest to abate corners of this whole system. So good luck with all that.
Thank you.
Thomas, if I may call on you, please, would be pleased to hear your views on hydrogen market dynamics and where's the Rocky Mountain Institute fit into all this?
For sure, I'll get to that as well. Good evening, I'll say. I'm also dialing in from Europe. If I'm getting a bit shady here, it's because it's getting dark outside. I'm a little bit up north. I will I will say a few things. I think what is quite exciting about the hydrogen markets currently is that the whole discussion in the last 18 months has really pivoted from a megawatt scale discussion to a gigawatt scale discussion. So, what has been 18 months ago was considered as an opportunity for long distance trucking, where the electrolyzers were discussed to be roughly 20 megawatts, and that was thought of as a large scale project. We're now seeing the world's first 1+ gigawatt project in the Middle East that's being built now. And just today, I think Australia announced that they're going to put $50 billion worth of green hydrogen money to work in Pilbara. So these projects are becoming real, and they're becoming really large. So we're really going from sort of academic research to real investments in steel in the ground, right? And obviously, those studies like the one you have done here is really what has been in the first stage here. So indeed, Europe leading a lot of the work with their hydrogen master plan here. They're talking about order of magnitude 40 gigawatts of hydrogen by 2030 for sort of core supply of Europe. And then they're looking at additional 20 plus 20 gigawatts supplied from Northern Africa and sort of Ukraine, Belarus area to feed into Europe, where there is simply not real estate enough to generate that hydrogen locally, right? And what's driving this is really, in my view, three things. One is that a lot of economies currently are sitting on import dependencies that are, sensitive. And this is, you have to realize, and you'll hear that as a theme here, that the U.S. markets are quite different from most markets in this case, right? So in the U.S., you have low cost domestic supply of natural gas, which you share with a few other economies, but not a lot, right? So Europe, they're exposed to import from Tavares, Vladimir Putin, and so are a lot of other economies. And you have Southeast Asia, Japan, they're exposed to very high cost LNG imports, and they're looking for options, partly because they have a single exposure. They want to diversify that import exposure, and they also want to make sure that they have high security of supply in going forward, right? The second thing that's driving this is that hydrogen is really an opportunity to monetize what I think of as the renewable resource beyond what you can do by getting to sort of saturation levels in the local power grid. So different grids, depending on how, what kind of a grid system you have traditional saturation levels at roughly 15% renewables. With batteries technology and other balancing technologies coming down in cost, you'll see that penetration saturation increase, and arguably over time we will enable we'll enable 100% renewable grids, but we're not there yet. And that means that even if you have magnificent resources in terms of the sun shining and the wind blowing, there's a limit to how much you can monetize, right? So some examples of this are, by all means, the opportunity for Houston, but also countries like Chile, who are having a very high-profile position now in the United Nations conversations about becoming a major hydrogen exporter and basically leveraging the insulation and the radiation in the Atacama Desert to make significant amounts of hydrogen and ship it out to the world, right? And the third is, and we've been onto that, is that hydrogen lets you solve some adjacent problems in the transition, such as long-term storage. You can make productive use of curtailed power, and you can reduce some of the infrastructure costs of large-scale renewable projects, especially offshore wind. As mentioned already, there is an interesting potential synergy between hydrogen and offshore wind. I will say, based on, before I also share a few words on Rocky Mountain Institute, in light of all this, when I see the investment numbers in the last slide presented here, single-digit billions of dollars of investment is not going to make Texas a world-leading hydrogen hub. That's just not that's not the scale of markets we're talking about. You're going to be a significant market, but you're for sure not going to be a global market. I think the key here is to understand, especially given the competitiveness of low-cost natural gas, is to understand the export opportunities, and they can come in two flavors. It can either be a pipeline over the border to neighboring states, or it can be shipped hydrogen. And there's a lot of technology innovation opportunities in shipping. The opportunity for pipeline is twofold. I think one is moving energy as hydrogen as a pipeline is almost 10 times cheaper than moving it as electrons in a high voltage transmission line. So that's a huge cost saver in terms of moving energy around if the end use is the hydrogen market, right? And secondly, ERCOT at the moment is kept as a state level market to avoid some federal regulations. And I don't think there's a lot of interest in expanding the power system beyond the Texas border. But you can imagine, obviously, and you are already shipping gas outside of Texas, and you can do that without getting under FERC regulation, right? So I think there are a couple of really interesting opportunities here on the export side. I'll just say as a final point, on Rocky Mountain Institute, we really do two things in hydrogen. We are looking at accelerating technology. So we have a venture effort that is supporting technology in other areas, but also specifically in hydrogen. And then we're also leading what we call a market making effort, where we engage with local coalitions to sort of really establish early and nascent markets at scale.
Terrific, Thomas. Thanks very much for that really terrific kind of Cook's tour, if you will, of the globe and things happening with hydrogen, import-export dynamics. I think you make a very fair point about the investment too. I know Josh is on mute, but if he was allowed to jump in, yeah, we took a conservative approach, even in that middle, and maybe I'd say especially in that expand phase. So we're really putting numbers around the trucking scaling and the extension of the CCUS system to pick up additional SMR plants. The first phase only has 8, and there are 48. So we had visibility into those, but your point's well taken. If we're really going to capture full potential as an exporter, there's a big wedge in that middle tranche. And then, we put TBD on that last tranche, because I think you're right. The numbers go up exponentially, obviously, if we're going to play a serious.
And just to tease you with a factoid here, broadly speaking, a single steel mill represents roughly 100,000 fuel cell trucks. So the increments of scale here of different end use applications are very different. And if you start including especially heavy industry, and especially the non-natural gas heavy industry, because again, obviously you have very competitive natural gas, that transition will be challenging in the Houston area. And so other industries that are using not based on natural gas are quite interesting.
Yeah, very good. Randy, I'm sure you're chomping at the bit, and we're chomping at the bit to hear from you. So your take on global hydrogen dynamics and the role of the Atlantic Council?
Thanks, Andy. Thanks to all the other panelists, and particularly the students at University of Houston. That was a really phenomenal presentation and a really ambitious plan. The Atlantic Council is a global policy organization, and our energy team works on issues related to energy security as well as sustainability. And so hydrogen sort of fits neatly into both because it solves so many different challenges, as a number of the other panelists have talked about. Our focus on hydrogen, though, right, is currently on the United States. So my comments will be sort of in a policy bucket and then a bit in a technical bucket. And the reason we focus on the United States is because the US is frankly behind from a policy perspective where Europe and Japan and a few others are. And so we think that there is a real opportunity for the US to step up and take the lead. What is great about what you've presented today, the Houston plan, is that it's this type of initiative that we need to see from the potential key sort of instigators of a hydrogen economy in the United States. You're seeing efforts from California as well. There are preliminary conversations going on in sort of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, where there's another opportunity for natural gas to hydrogen for industry, refining, et cetera. And then there's another potential opportunity across the Midwest, the Great Plains into the industrial parts of Illinois and Indiana. But all those regions working separately it's important that they're doing this, but working together and working at the federal level actually could make this much more effective and make this happen much faster. We're going to be leading a national hydrogen policy sprint starting in January that hopes to set a few objectives and sort of shape national policy, working very closely with a number of key state and local stakeholders to try to accelerate the kinds of things that you're doing already in Houston with this effort. A couple areas where I see things that need to be talked about. First and foremost, Andy, I think that it's absolutely right that Houston is going to be a blue hydrogen hub. The green hydrogen opportunities are there as well, but as I'll get into in the technical bit of my comments, blue hydrogen is absolutely crucial. I think one thing that is that wasn't discussed, but I think is really worth talking about is methane regulation. If you are going to be producing blue hydrogen, the embodied carbon in that is going to be directly related to the methane leakage, the venting and the flaring and the pipelines. And this issue, I think, is going to become ever more important. As we saw just this week, the French government put a stop to Engie's plan to work with Next Generation on LNG export because of the methane issues in the United States. So this is going to require both federal level action, but also probably going to require the Railroad Commission to act as well. That's going to be complicated, but probably necessary in order to make the blue hydrogen something that you can ultimately export from Houston. At the federal level, one of the things that we think probably needs to happen is an examination of the current gas pipeline infrastructure for its readiness for hydrogen. This has been done in Europe, and what they found is that about 70% of the pipeline in Europe is ready for hydrogen or can be readily modified to take certain degrees of hydrogen blending. Some of it is just not, that remaining 30% is just not economical to retrofit or whatnot. It probably needs to be rebuilt. That's been done partially in the United States, but again, to get to that, building a hydro economy in the United States where Houston can be exporting to other states, we'll want to be thinking through what the pipeline network can be, whether you're blending or using dedicated pipelines. Mm-hmm. So moving over to the technical piece. And why I think it's just the blue hydrogen discussion is crucial, even though if you read a lot of what's coming out of Europe with the focus on green hydrogen, at least from the sort of political side, you talk to the policymakers, they recognize this. But I think it's just crucial to put some numbers behind what Andy said about just the power generation required to produce green hydrogen, just to put it in context. There's a pretty significant hydrogen economy already in the United States, a gray hydrogen economy. If you were to try to convert the gray hydrogen already produced in the United States to green hydrogen, you would need more than 50% of the nuclear capacity of the United States. And that's using high temperature electrolysis, which is more efficient than electrolysis that you get from renewables. You use the heat from nuclear as well as the electricity. So that's more than 50% of the nuclear capacity, or that's essentially 10% of total power generation in the United States, just to turn the gray hydrogen economy to be green. or pink if you're counting it as nuclear. The color coding for hydrogen is expansive and often contradictory. Nuclear is sometimes pink. Nuclear is sometimes called yellow. There's turquoise as well. The colors keep growing. Sort of thinking more globally, if you want to think, one of the major uses of hydrogen right now is for ammonia. If you want to replace all of the gray hydrogen used in ammonia right now, you would need nearly all of the variable renewable capacity installed at the end of 2017 globally. So you just take all that power away from the grid and put it into green hydrogen. So you're just, this is the scale we're talking about. If you want to replace global diesel demand, so if you're going to, all the diesel in the world, you're going to swap all that out for a fuel cell, whether you're, mostly trucking, but other uses as well, you need 5 to 6 times the total installed variable renewable capacity right now. So it's just a huge amount of power we're talking about, which just goes to emphasize why blue hydrogen is so important. Just one more point on the technical piece and why this ties back to the policy level. There's been a lot of conversation in about green hydrogen taking advantage of curtailed renewable power. And that seems like a great opportunity, as Thomas talked about and as others have suggested. However, right now, with the cost of electrolyzers where they are, it's simply not economic to be utilizing them at 5, 6, 10% rates, depending on how much curtailed power there is. You really, with electrolyzer costs where they are, you really need to be building dedicated renewable facilities. So there's a dedicated wind farm being built in the Midwest, and they're putting that hydrogen on, will be when it's all done, putting that hydrogen on trains and shipping it to California. If you think about hydrogen as playing a role in helping balance the grid and helping create cross-seasonal storage, et cetera, we really need to get the cost of electrolyzers down dramatically, and that is going to require investment. That's happening in Europe, but we need to see more of that in the United States. I'll end there.
Mm-hmm. That's great, Randy, and particularly helpful to enunciate the volume requirements we're talking about, and the scale of power and the scale of hydrogen involved, and also to shed light on blue versus green. I am trying to track audience participants. Thank you for the questions you're submitting. I see a few around this question of blue versus green, and Randy, you shed some very nice light on that. I'd like to ask perhaps Allison, since you talked about playing in both chains, if you will, your perspectives, scaling blue, green, timing of green, how's that all balance out in your mind?
Well, so I think when we're talking, it depends on if you're talking about like for what can be done in Houston versus what can be done in terms of massive scale up to meet the broad performance-driven goal of the energy transition, right, which is the net zero commitment by 2015 that Baker Hughes and Mitsubishi both undertaken. So if we were going to talk locally, I think a lot can be done in a shorter period of time. But when we talk about the global scale up, I hear people estimate, parts of this can be done within 5 years. I think that is incredibly ambitious. I think in fact, a lot of work has been done to show that there's a fairly substantial amount of infrastructure work, as you guys have very elegantly elaborated on, that needs to be done in different corners of the world. I also think it's never underestimate the ability of governments to signal a commitment, but yet not have enough financial and political will to follow through, okay? And so deployment really at a broad scale hangs in the balance of whether it's blue or teal or gray, however we want to talk about this. We're at a time right now that the energy transition has actually kind of accelerated in many corners, but at the same time, it's low capital allocation, right? Companies don't have the kind of money to put towards that, so they defer to nation states and state and provincial governments. So with that lens, and I thought Randy talked he spoke to a lot of this pretty well, but but to drive it home just a little bit more, governments are going to have to make some hard choices in the next decade following what's happened with the pandemic. And so probably people here were like, oh, well, yay, a webinar that's not about the pandemic. But at the same time, what's happening with where we're going for the energy transition, for funding, matters on what happens in the next couple of years in recovery. And so our economic positioning around the world is we're faced with the most crippling debt in the history of mankind that comes out of the back of a pandemic because of all of the bankruptcies, all of the people out of work, et cetera. You know, we all know what we're living in. And so at the end of the day, will governments be able to back the funding commitments that they put on the table? Or will they have to spend money for food and for being able to provide living wages while we come out of a recovery? I mean, I think that will defer deployment of hydrogen in a meaningful way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't mean to sound sad in that regard, but that is realistic. I'd like for it to be different. I'd love to hear.
No, very fair. And you as well as Thomas. I mean, these aren't small numbers we're talking about. They're going to require trade-offs. So thank you very much for that. Yeah, I know we're starting to get close to the end of our agreed time frame. I did just have a couple other questions and really like to bring it back, if it's okay, to the Houston plan that we outlined. Now, you've all hit aspects of that in your comments previously, but one of the reasons we're deferring our final report is to frankly tap the wisdom of the four of you. Again, we appreciate your joining us today. So either if you have anything more to say about the report, or if you just want to pick it up coming from the outside in, looking at Houston, what would you suggest for Houston? And I'll just take a couple volunteers if one or two of you would like to further comment.
I don't have to share some thoughts if you want.
Sure, go ahead.
I mean, I think, and I already mentioned a few of them, right? But I do think, and this is also my experience from talking about the hydrogen opportunity in several regions, and you can see some of that bearing fruit in Europe and sort of other areas, is that it is actually, you get to quite different answers whether you approach the opportunity sort of incrementally bottom up, or if you start with a bold ambition and see what that would look like, right? And especially since, as pointed out, there are some quite significant infrastructure links to the opportunity. So, you know, you could either look at how many trucks you'll have to wait for until you merit significant infrastructure, or, you know, you can look at what you can enable with that infrastructure. And I know that the U.S. might not be in general might not be the market where you lead with infrastructure, but it actually does make a difference, right? And it's worth considering at least sort of two optional pathways for Houston, and that could be a good thought experiment to see if, you know, you might land in the same, but it's a good thought experiment to see if you get a significantly different view, right?
Yeah, no, that's very helpful, Thomas. We were challenged along the way by various collaborators I mentioned. What's the default case? What if we don't get funding and policy support? How far do you go economically? How far do you go incrementally? And I think this two paths notion, top down, bottom up, could be another way to kind of to bring out some of those choices and funding choices, et cetera. Last question prepared, and then I'll circle back a little bit on the audience questions if we have any more time. You all have international backgrounds to varying degrees, and have seen hydrogen systems develop. And Thomas, your comments kind of starting to get into this. What would you suggest for Houston? You know, reflecting on those experiences, how would you think we ought to get this hydrogen expansion going? May Randy start with you, or?
Sure. Well, you know, in the end, you have the hydrogen already in Houston. Of course, Houston has more hydrogen pipeline than anywhere else in the world. You already are really the hydrogen hub. And so what I would be interested in seeing is experiments like you're already starting to see in Italy and in Europe, where you're already trying, like what SNAM is doing, for instance. It's already been discussed. Try experiments with hydrogen blending into the gas system where possible. Really getting demonstration projects off the ground so that you can build public support and show that this is real and not just not just a good idea but hard to implement. So I would look for those easy wins like we've started to see in Europe, because that really does start accelerating public interest in this in hydrogen.
That's great. Thank you. Zhao, how do you see things? Lots of toes in the European country waters,
Yes.
among others. How are they getting this going, and what should Houston take from all that?
So it's true that Europe has done a lot of work, and it's Europe at so the EU level, which has certain responsibilities but doesn't have all the responsibilities, and then of course the member states, the different countries, will have other tasks to accelerate this transition to blue, green, renewable, hydrogen. I think what I would recommend to Houston is really to start a strong collaborative partnerships, both public and private, but also then with other regions that are doing the same, other hubs in Europe. So in Europe we have, and I will not name them all, but we have Ghent just here next door. In Belgium we have Rotterdam, Groningen in the Netherlands, and we have more recent, perhaps more in its infancy, but we have CCUS in Portugal, my home country. And they all play with different elements. So in Portugal, for instance, we have one of the lowest worldwide electricity cost from solar PV. So basically they want to utilize that as a competitive advantage to produce renewable hydrogen, and they will focus solely on renewable hydrogen. And from there, and this is an industrial, of course, it's a part of an industrial policy. It's not only about climate policies, it has to be also a growth opportunity for countries. Then you link these, and Portugal has just signed recently an MOU with the Netherlands, where they will be exporting this green hydrogen to the Netherlands. So I think these kind of partnerships are very helpful. And then, of course, the policy policy framework has to be there. One thing that helps, and I think I agree with a lot of my colleagues here in the panel regarding the volumes that you need. So you really need demand at scale. Transport, yes, it's a priority in Europe, but it's not all types of transport, of mobility modes. But we see really the hard to abate industry as the main focus to create those levels of demand. And that's why also in the short term, Europe believes that blue hydrogen will be somehow needed. But so you need to create this price parity that is totally lacking today between renewable or even hydrogen with fossil hydrogen that we have today. I'm not sure we will do that in the same way we did with renewables, because we're talking about kind of different things in renewables. The OPEX is not really relevant but the capex is, and here you have a difference with renewable hydrogen, for instance, where that operational expenditure is quite relevant. So we hope to have some, of course, we need some kind of incentives to reduce the technology costs, but then that doesn't really mean that these will decrease the costs of producing hydrogen. So there, of course, we are exploring the carbon contracts for difference as a potential method to really incentivize decarbonization projects. So I think that's something that could be looked at. And then, of course, public procurement. We did a little research, and public procurement amounts to an average of 13% of GDP in OECD countries. So it's huge. So if we really want to get this done, and I feel what Alison mentioned about the crisis and the pandemic and so on, but in Europe, at least, we talk about the cost of inaction as well. That might be higher. And that's why I mentioned also the stranded assets in the beginning. This becomes a bigger and bigger concern. And the financial community is waking up. There again, in Europe, we have all these taxonomy regulation coming up, trying to separate what is sustainable, what is not a sustainable investment. Will have a huge impact on our investments and our way forward. So I think overall collaborative approach, public-private partnerships, and a good doses of policy we should get it right.
Mm-hmm. Boy, you covered a nice gamut there, Jal. Thank you. And I know this is perhaps unfair, any suggestions on which levers among the ones you mentioned ought to be forefront in the case of Houston?
Oof, that's the. I think that, so we are not yet in a moment in time where there are a lot of lessons learned, but there are some. And so I think that really establishing a good network between the other hubs all over the world, trying to learn what are I think the steps that everyone is taking. I think we mentioned that in Europe, we are quite advanced also already on the discussion about the infrastructure. We have this hydrogen backbone study. I think that would be definitely an idea to also then understand what needs to be demonstrated, what's already there, where you can learn, also trying to rationalize the investments and the learning curves.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Yeah, I'll tell you, we learned an awful lot by looking at what Europe's doing and case studies across the chain. So I'm taking away from this, we need to make that kind of an ongoing organic thing, because like you say, the lessons learned they're happening every day. The learning curve is so steep, and Houston can certainly benefit from that. Terrific, thank you. Alison, did you have anything you wanted to add to this? What Houston ought to do to move things forward? Or
Yeah, actually, I really liked, there was something in everybody's presentation today that I thought was really good, that were really good takeaways. I think it was Randy who brought up methane in particular, and I thought that was really an excellent thing to highlight as we talk about, looking at Houston as a hydrogen hub. Let us not ignore if gas is a feedstock, that we will be pressed to make sure that we can reduce any kind of fugitives along the system, right? As it comes into that. And so thinking about methane is just keep that in the back of our minds. But in terms of where we could first nucleate, I think it's got to start in the partnership phase, which you guys have definitely started for the city of Houston. And I think as Annie and I have talked about this previously, it's important to raise it for this audience that a lot can be done if you don't have capital up front. Like, that's where we're going to leverage what's available for public funding today through partnerships. And I think the strength of the proposal comes from the quality of the partners that come to the table. And so I would say let's use today's forum to say, let's nucleate a group of people who want to work together on the policy challenges for the project. Let's look at a group of people who would like to get together and start to really think about collaborative proposals to get some public funding. And that would be a really productive way and a good way to prioritize this, rather than just saying, who's going to be able to allocate some money for startup, because I think that's really challenging for people and companies like that sit actually in Houston right now, because we're all pretty impacted by market prices and what's happening in the world. So let's focus on policy and collaborating on some good proposals.
Yeah. Well, and as you said earlier, one of your P's, was it the prowess of the companies? Private sector prowess, and if we don't have private sector prowess in Houston, where are we going to find it?
I know. And so let's bring it all together. I mean, you've got a great group of people here, and we can start to think about how we can collaborate. I know that I have as an action item that I'm going to be calling a couple people here to talk about some of the policy work that's been described, so we can think about how to help.
Yeah. Okay. Terrific. And highlighting methane again, as Randy did earlier, it's, if we're going to have aspirations in blue, I take both your points, goes hand in hand with how methane emissions are handled. Randy, could you comment a little bit more? You mentioned the policy sprint, I think was the term you used earlier. How would you envision that, and how would you envision that, vis-a-vis Houston? I know it's broader than that, but vis-a-vis Houston and beyond.
Yeah. So the policy sprint, it's a 6-month effort that will bring together a range of different stakeholders. We absolutely want Houston involved in this, as well as pretty much everybody on this call is going to be getting an email from me later today or next week about this. And we already have a couple of stakeholders who are committed to doing this. We'll be doing a series of workshops starting in January, looking at the production issues, transportation issues, storage issues, and then the demand side, sort of creating the demand, and what policies that the U.S. needs to undertake, federal level, and then at key state and local levels to accelerate the hydrogen economy. So again, I've said some of the ideas that we are already cooking up. We absolutely think that there needs to be a look at the pipeline system and really understand. It's been partially done, but really understand where the pipelines need to be can be retrofitted, where there are opportunities. I mean, for instance, there is an ammonia pipeline system in the Midwest, so that's a different way of thinking about transporting hydrogen. So that's one. Investment and sort of basic research coming from government, particularly on electrolyzers. That's key, but also continuing to push on carbon capture, also a crucial element, particularly when you're thinking about blue. The methane piece, that's incredibly relevant. And there's a lot more that I don't even know yet that we want to be bringing from the key stakeholders. So I will be following up, have no fear.
Well, it's very exciting that you're going to do that. And then it may be too early to ask, but I mean, is it going to be a satellite or a sub-team, Houston sub-team, if you will, or how would you envision?
I hope so. Yeah, I mean, we see working with as 3 or 4 key regions in the United States where there's early opportunities for hydrogen. So Houston, California, the sort of New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Ohio, they're farther behind, but there's real opportunity there. And then again, the Midwest, because of wind, the ammonia, the industry are all there in one spot. But really California and Houston are the early leaders, but you would want to involve the others as well.
Sure.
So, and hopefully connecting, because as others have said, really having these partnerships and lessons learned would be important. We will also be bringing in folks from Europe and Japan who have learned lessons as well.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. Great. Very exciting. Thomas, I didn't want to leave you out. Did you have something you wanted to add on what Houston should be taking away from all these efforts around the globe to activate hydrogen, and what we should be doing?
Thanks for the opportunity. I think I'll have two things to mention in addition to everything that is already said, building on it. I think one is this whole notion of access to capital is obviously real. I think a wise man said to me once that the transition of capital is not going to happen by investors telling the world what they're going to invest in. It's going to happen by investors telling the world what they're not going to invest in, because they're not in a position to publicly pick technologies or pick projects. They're always going to have a threshold for returns on their investments. And, you know, traditionally most investors have been completely agnostic, if you like, in terms of what they invest in. But you do see significant investors at scale, pension funds and others, that are actually putting stakes in the ground and saying that they're not going to invest more in fossil fuel projects. So I think that's going to push capital, because they still have capital they need to put to work, right? They need to generate returns on that capital, and they need to move it into the market. And that's going to push capital towards these kinds of opportunities, right? So you want to position yourself as a recipient of that flow of capital. I think the second thought is, I think, and not to overcomplicate things, but there is a sort of an additional layer to this hydrogen markets, which is the manufacturing and technology race, if you like. And I think, and that's one of the reasons it's intriguing to think at scale, because when you come to the 10 plus gigawatt scale of electrolyzers, that's a full order book for a significant manufacturing facility for, you know, electrolyzers for half a decade or a decade. And that means that you can attract that technology play. And I can tell you, you know, Germany and European countries, they are quite bitter over the fact that they invested policy money, R&D, and years of sort of efforts into the solar technology, and the whole industry went to China. You know, they are hell-bent on not doing, repeating that mistake for hydrogen. So, and I would also say that, you know, the total capacity of electrolyzer manufacturing globally today is roughly a gigawatt. So again, looking back at the numbers, if you want, you know, 40 gigawatts, globally maybe 100 gigawatts between 2030, 2035, that manufacturing capacity also needs to scale very rapidly. So you see players like Nel and Yara, but if you look at the manufacturers of electrolyzers, they're all figuring out where do we want to put the next plant, right? And that's another opportunity for Houston to say, we can be one of those clusters. We can, you know, and that will also provide, I would argue, you know, high value, long-term jobs in a way that you don't get from the construction of new assets. And an electrolyzer, from a long-term jobs created per revenue dollar, is fairly low. But the electrolyzer manufacturing business have a significantly higher job creation per revenue dollar, right?
Yeah, that's great. That is a really good wicket. And I'd like to pull on that thread a little bit further, because all of you have mentioned the criticality of funding and the magnitude of the funding and the trade-offs around the funding. And maybe we'll end on that. I got a little bit of leeway from our organizers to extend a little bit. So let's finish that theme, and then we'll thank the panel. But so I like your term, Thomas, of ourselves to be a recipient of the flow of capital. So I'd like to get other panelists' ideas on how does Houston do that? So maybe Thomas, you know, when you talked about the electrolyzer, what came to my mind was the kind of electrolyzer park that Rotterdam is establishing. And Shell and BP have projects nearing FID as kind of you know, initial projects within that broader construct. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about, or what in a Houston context could that look like?
Well, I'd say, again, conversation pivots quickly from sort of market to policy to politics. And I think a lot of everything is moving so fast that, and this is, I'll just give you my perspective here. I think that the considerations of where to put the next plant is arguably obviously there is some robust analysis going in there, but there's just not that much to build it on in terms of actual committed pipelines of projects, right? So there's a little bit of guesswork, and that guesswork has to be based on political intent. It's got to be based on public announcements. It's got to be based on directional policies. And if you compare Houston and Texas with Europe, Southeast Asia, Australia, you don't really have any of that. You don't have the same level of political aspiration, at least publicly announced. You don't have the same, emerging views on large-scale infrastructural projects. You don't have the same amount of public commitments. So in lieu of having actual project pipelines, which otherwise in other commodity industries, you have an actual, project pipeline that you can go to, you can buy the database basically, right? And you can plan based on it. They can't really do that with hydrogen because the projects are not announced at that granularity yet. So I think that's my 5 cents here.
Yeah, no, that's great. So maybe 30 seconds from Randy, you would like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I just have one very specific thing that I think is going to be important, particularly for Houston, and it ties back to policy again, but that's the extension of the 45Q tax credit. It's taken a couple of years for the IRS to figure that out, and so there's not as much time. Houston can't do it unilaterally, but it can work with the representatives and senators to try to push on that. I think that's going to be crucial for getting enough investment in carbon capture. And then really leading on, there's still some questions in a number of investors' minds about how to invest in carbon capture. So really working on that as well.
Yeah, great. Allison, any final thoughts on making Houston the the natural recipient of the flow of capital?
Well, I'll very short. I'll say. We're committing, this is me committing to help in the project through Baker Hughes in terms of what we can provide on policy. So we want to help ensure success of building the hydrogen corridor in a much more robust way.
Excellent, very much appreciated. Zhao, any final thoughts from you on that question?
Yes. It's not an easy question, but I will try my very best. I think you need to keep aligned two fundamental pillars of all this discussion. One is the climate ambition and the climate neutrality objectives, which has a very political dimension as well, not only scientific, but it's, and I will not further comment on that, but then you also have this growth opportunity, as it was mentioned. There are these new industries, the offshore wind industry, these electrolyzers, manufacturing industry that will bring fresh new jobs, or in a certain way also keep jobs. So I think those two have to be thought together, which was not always the case until now, and that's why we had the tragic experience with the PV. If you keep these together and you have companies like ours engaged, definitely I think Houston can be and will be a success story for sure.
Terrific watchwords to end on: ambition and opportunity. Like those very much. So, panelists, thank you very much. Really appreciate your joining us and sharing all this terrific perspective. Very helpful. Participants, thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate your doing that, and Sorry about running a little bit long, but we thought the discussion was really exciting and productive, and thought we'd continue it just a little bit over the appointed time. So thank you all for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you so very much. And Allison, we're going to remember your promise to connect, and we will certainly hope to make sure that that happens. And Jal, thank you so much for joining us from Europe. Thomas, likewise. And Randy, thank you for all your insights. And Andy, what a terrific panel you put together. So thank you. Thank you to your colleagues from KPMG and the students from University of Houston for an absolutely terrific presentation. And thanks to my colleagues at the Center for Houston's Future for their partnership, and for TEEP for really advertising this program out to the open world. Lastly, we do have our next symposium on the circular plastics economy that will be coming up pretty soon in mid-November or in early December. We're just trying to finalize the details on that, but that's going to be another interesting story about how Houston can decarbonize the world. So with that, thank you all for joining. Really enjoyed it, and look forward to the collaborations here. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.